There is a name that, for nearly 2 centuries, made governments nervous and kings attentive. A name that was synonymous with palaces, with power, with the kind of wealth so staggering that it was almost impossible to comprehend from the outside. And then something happened. Slowly, across generations, the foundations shifted. The money didn't entirely disappear. The name didn't lose its weight. But the world changed around it in ways that could not be stopped. And the women who carried that name forward did so in directions nobody could have predicted. This is the story of the Rothschild women, what they inherited, what they lost, and who they chose to become, what they were born into. To understand where the Rothschild women stand today, you have to understand what the family once was, and just how far the distance is between that world and this one. The story begins in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt, Germany, in the second half of the 18th century. Maya Amschel Rothschild, born in 1744, grew up in a cramped, walled neighborhood where Jewish residents were confined by law, permitted only certain trades, and excluded from most of the social and civic life around them. He started as a dealer in rare coins, caught the attention of William IX, the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, and began doing business for the court. Then he had a structural insight that changed everything. Wealth should be managed across generations, not consumed within one. He formalized this idea in an early family partnership agreement, and then he had 5 sons. Those 5 sons, Amschel, Salomon, Nathan, Carl, and James, fanned out across Europe. By the 1820s, they had established banking houses in Frankfurt, London, Vienna, Paris, and Naples. Maya had built, in a single lifetime, the skeleton of the first true international banking network. Nathan, who settled in London, became so important to the British financial system that in 1909, David Lloyd George, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, described his successor, Lord Rothschild, as the most powerful man in Britain. That was not considered hyperbole at the time. In 1875, the British government needed to move quickly to purchase a controlling stake in the Suez Canal. The transaction required £4 million in cash, more or less immediately. There was no time to raise the money through Parliament. Nathan's son, Lionel, lent the British government the money overnight. They bought the canal. The family loaned money to warring nations, financed railway networks across Europe, held a central position in the world trade of oil and metals, and at their peak in the 19th century, possessed what was documented as the largest private fortune in the world. They built at least 41 palaces across Europe, a number that historians note exceeded even the grandest royal estates of the era. At Tring Park in Hertfordshire, one branch of the English family maintained a private natural history museum and a personal menagerie that included kangaroos, emus, giant tortoises, and a team of zebras that could be harnessed to a carriage. The name Rothschild did not merely mean rich. In France, Rothschild became a common noun, a synonym for seemingly endless wealth, neo-Gothic grandeur, and a kind of Epicurean existence so elevated it existed almost outside ordinary imagination. A British newspaper in 1836 described the family as the wonders of modern banking, rising higher than emperors and holding a whole continent in the hollow of their hands. That was not considered flattery. It was considered more or less accurate. And yet, by the time the 20th century arrived, the first cracks were already forming. Not because of any single disaster, though disasters were coming, but because the world the Rothschilds had been built to navigate was beginning to change beneath their feet. By the late 19th century, the rise of large joint stock banks across Europe had broken the near monopoly on international finance that the family had held for decades. The creation of national taxation systems forced the family's various branches to operate more independently, gradually loosening the tight, coordinated structure that had given Mayor Amschel's original network its power. The system of five brothers working in perfect concert all but dissolved by World War I. And then came a series of blows that the family could not have entirely anticipated, even with all their intelligence and foresight. The first came not in a boardroom, but in a museum in Vienna, and it began with a knock on the door. What the war took. In March 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria in what was called the Anschluss. Within days, sometimes within hours, the consequences for the Austrian branch of the Rothschild family were catastrophic. Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild, who had been managing the family's Creditanstalt Bank and its associated industrial companies, was arrested at the airport in Vienna as he attempted to leave the country. He was held by the Nazi authorities while negotiations over the family's assets were conducted. He was visited in captivity by Heinrich Himmler. The family ultimately paid what was reported to be $21 million, believed at the time to be the largest ransom ever paid for any individual, to secure his release. He was freed in 1939. He went to the United States and never returned. What remained in Austria was plundered. The Nazi regime confiscated approximately 3,500 works of art from the Rothschild collection alone. Many of those works were designated for Hitler's planned Führer Museum in Linz. The family's Viennese palaces, buildings that had defined the look of the city for generations, were confiscated, stripped, and eventually destroyed. In exchange for permission to export whatever remained of her collection to the United States after the war, one baroness was required to donate approximately 250 of the finest works to the Austrian state. It was not a request she was in a position to refuse. In France, the situation for the French branch was no less harrowing. Philippine de Rothschild was born in Paris on November 22, 1933. The only child of Baron Philippe de Rothschild. When France fell to the Germans in 1940, her father escaped to London to work with General de Gaulle and the Free French Resistance. He urged his wife, Elizabeth, who was from a French Catholic family, to come with him. She chose to stay, believing that her Catholic background would protect her and her daughter. It did not protect her. Elizabeth Pelletier de Chambord died at Ravensbrück, the Nazi women's concentration camp north of Berlin, in 1945. Philippine was 6 years old when the occupation began. She survived the war years in France by using her mother's maiden name, concealing her Rothschild identity. The name that had once signified unimaginable wealth and social standing had, under Nazi occupation, become something that could get you killed. She grew up understanding that in her bones. Years later, she said plainly that when your name is Rothschild, everyone assumes you had an easy childhood. Hers was not. The war also took a significant toll on the broader family in a financial sense that went beyond direct confiscation. The cost of both world wars was so enormous for European economies that the international framework, which had sustained the Rothschild banking network, the lending to sovereign governments, the management of national debts, the cross-border financial infrastructure, was increasingly absorbed by newer international institutions. The creation of bodies like the International Monetary Fund after World War II changed the landscape in ways that made the old model of private banking families serving as lenders of last resort to governments largely obsolete. What remained of the family's various branches after the war was still wealthy by any ordinary standard. But the question of what would come next, how the wealth would be managed, who would step forward to manage it, and what shape the Rothschild legacy would take as the 20th century unfolded, had become genuinely open. The answers came, unexpectedly, mostly from the women. And the first of those answers was one that nobody in the family saw coming. The Baroness who chose jazz. Among all the Rothschild women of the 20th century, the one who made the most dramatic and most public departure from everything the family name implied was Pannonica Rothschild, born on December 10th, 1913, the youngest daughter of Charles Rothschild and his wife, Hungarian Baroness Rosika von Wertheimstein. She was known as Nika, and she would become one of the most unconventional figures the family had ever produced. She grew up in the fullest possible version of Rothschild privilege. The family seat at Tring Park, where the kangaroos wandered in the grounds, and her uncle Walter maintained his private natural history museum. A vast collection that would eventually include more than 3 million specimens. She took walks in white dresses with her governess and her siblings through grounds that contained emus, giant tortoises, and a team of zebras that could be harnessed to a carriage. The world she was born into operated at a remove from ordinary experience that was so complete it was almost impossible to imagine from the outside. She was educated as befitted a daughter of the house. She was introduced to jazz by her brother Victor. She was taught to fly by a saxophonist, a detail that sits comfortably alongside everything else that was unusual about her. As a young woman, she was presented as a debutante, which was the social ritual through which wealthy families of that era formally introduced their daughters to the marriage market. She did marry Jules de Koenigswarter, a French diplomat who fought for the Free French forces during World War II. Nika herself was not passive during the war. She helped get her children to safety in America, placing them with the Guggenheim family on Long Island. She then joined the Free French Army, working as a decoder for Gaullist intelligence and serving as a radio host at Radio Brazzaville before becoming an ambulance driver for the 1st Free French Division in North Africa. By the end of the war, she had been decorated as a lieutenant by the Allied forces. After the war, she returned to life as a diplomat's wife in Mexico City. She had 5 children. She lived in a chateau. She was, by all outward appearances, exactly what a Rothschild woman of her generation was supposed to be. And then, around 1948, on a visit to New York, she stopped at a friend's apartment before catching a plane. The jazz musician Teddy Wilson put on a recording of a piece called Round Midnight by a relatively unknown pianist named Thelonious Monk. She listened to it 20 times in a row. She missed her plane. In fact, as she later described it, she never really went home. By 1951, she had effectively left her former life behind. The chateau, the diplomatic circuit, the world her marriage had placed her in, and established herself in New York. Her husband, Jules de Koenigswarter, eventually divorced her, in large part because of what happened next. In March 1955, the jazz saxophonist Charlie Parker came to Nika's suite at the Stanhope Hotel in New York while ill. He resisted going to hospital and died there on March 15th, 1955. He was 34 years old. The tabloids ran the story with predictable fury. Bob King dies in heiress's flat. She was kicked out of the Stanhope Hotel. The story spread on both sides of the Atlantic. The divorce followed. She moved across Central Park to the Bolivar Hotel and kept going. She became one of the most devoted patrons the New York jazz world had ever seen, paying rent for musicians who couldn't cover it, buying instruments back out of pawn, driving Thelonious Monk around the city in her Bentley when he needed to get to gigs, hosting late-night sessions in her suite that attracted some of the most important musicians of the era. She also sometimes found herself in legal difficulties she had not sought. In 1958, police stopped her car in Maryland and found marijuana belonging to Monk. She told the authorities it was hers and not his, and was sentenced to 3 years in prison, though she ultimately served far less. The musicians she loved wrote her into their music. Thelonious Monk composed Pannonica for her. Horace Silver wrote Nika's Dream. Gigi Grice, Sonny Clark, Kenny Dorham, Kenny Drew, Tommy Flanagan, more than a dozen pieces named after the Baroness who had turned her back on everything the Rothschild name was supposed to represent and found something that mattered more to her. Musicians who knew her from that era spoke about what she represented in the jazz world, not merely a patron, but someone who took the music seriously and took the musicians seriously, who showed up night after night when others dismissed bebop as noise, who made phone calls and wrote checks and drove people in her Bentley when they needed to be somewhere. Word would pass through clubs. Play well, the Baroness is out front. She was not there to be seen. She was there to listen. That distinction mattered in a world where wealthy patrons were often more interested in the social performance of being cultured than in the culture itself. Eventually, Monk himself came to live at her house in Weehawken, New Jersey, in the final years of his life, after his mental health had deteriorated and he had withdrawn from performing. Monk was not an easy person to care for. His mood could be unpredictable. He sometimes walked away from home without knowing where he was going. Nika remained. He lived there until his death from a stroke on February 17th, 1982. She had kept faith with him until the end. The woman from Tring Park, with the kangaroos in the grounds, now in a house in New Jersey with 300 cats, as various accounts described it, keeping watch over a jazz genius in his final years. She died on November 30th, 1988. Her children scattered her ashes over the Hudson River at midnight, a gesture that could only have been appropriate for her. Her great-niece, Hannah Rothschild, decades later, would make a documentary film about Nika's life, called The Jazz Baroness, broadcast on the BBC and HBO in 2009. And that brings us to the next generation, to what it meant to inherit the Rothschild name in a world that had changed almost beyond recognition, and to the women who found their own ways of carrying it. The scientist who never took a degree. Miriam Rothschild was born on August 5th, 1908, at Ashton Wold in Northamptonshire, England. She was the daughter of Charles Rothschild, the same Charles whose youngest daughter would become the Jazz Baroness. And she grew up at the intersection of two of the family's most powerful impulses, the love of science and the inheritance of privilege. Her family believed that formal education stifled the intellectual development of bright children. So Miriam was educated at home, encouraged to follow her curiosity wherever it led, and given access to everything a Rothschild fortune could provide in the way of books, specimens, laboratories, and expert company. By the time she was 4, she had started collecting ladybird beetles and caterpillars. She took a tame quail to bed with her. Her father, Charles, had described more than 500 species of flea, including Xenocilla chaopes, the rat flea, which carries bubonic plague. Her uncle Walter had built the private Natural History Museum at Tring, with a collection of more than 3 million specimens. Science was not a hobby in this household. It was a vocation. But Miriam's childhood was not without its shadows. Charles Rothschild struggled with his mental health for most of his adult life. He took his own life in 1923, when Miriam was 15. The loss was profound and sudden. She had been close to her father. He was the one who had first shown her fleas under a microscope, who had encouraged her curiosity in the direction that would define her life. His death left a silence in the household at Ashton Wold that never entirely filled. Her relationship with her uncle Walter, already close, became even more important to her after her father was gone. She also watched what happened to her sister Liberty, who developed schizophrenia in her teens. The illness was devastating, and the family's experience of watching Liberty's deterioration and of navigating the medical understanding of the time, which was limited and often harmful, stayed with Miriam for the rest of her life and directly influenced one of her most lasting acts of philanthropy. In 1962, she founded the Schizophrenia Research Fund in Liberty's honor, dedicated to advancing better understanding and treatment of the illness. Miriam's scientific career, which she built without a conventional degree, became one of the most extraordinary in British natural science. During the Second World War, she was recruited to work at Bletchley Park as part of the code-breaking operation alongside Alan Turing. After the war, she returned to her research and spent decades becoming the world's leading authority on fleas. She worked out the flea's jumping mechanism using high-speed photography. She published more than 300 scientific papers and 11 books. She became the first woman to serve as a trustee of the Natural History Museum, the first woman president of the Royal Entomological Society, and the first woman member of the prestigious 8-seat Entomological Club. In 1985, she was made a Fellow of the Royal Society, one of science's highest honours. In 2000, she was made a Dame of the British Empire. She worked across more than 7 decades of science, raised 6 children, and did it all from the family estate at Ashton Wold, which she gradually rewilded, replacing manicured lawns with native wildflowers, recruiting Prince Charles to the cause of natural landscape preservation, turning the grounds of a banking family's country house into a habitat for the insects and plants she had spent her life studying. She was also, by most accounts, magnificently eccentric. She became a vegetarian and a teetotaler. She wore white Wellington boots in the evenings and moon boots in winter and tennis shoes through the summer. She kept a butterfly specimen pinned to the arm of her sofa. She designed her wardrobe around a loose mauve silk dress and matching kerchief specifically, she explained, to cut down on the need to make unnecessary choices in the mornings. She wanted to save her mind for insects. The Guardian, on her death, described her as Queen Bee of research into parasites and their hosts. She died on January 20th, 2005, at Ashton Wold, at the age of 96. Because she never needed to apply for grants, the family fortune simply funded her laboratory directly. She operated outside the usual academic pressures of publish or perish and departmental politics. She published because she had things to say. She collaborated because she found people interesting. She was invited to lecture at the world's most distinguished scientific institutions and showed up in her moon boots. Miriam Rothschild never really left the world she was born into. She simply transformed the corner of it she inhabited into something entirely her own. And while Miriam was doing that in Northamptonshire, another Rothschild woman was doing something equally unexpected in the vineyards of Bordeaux. The Baroness who inherited the vines. Philippine de Rothschild was not supposed to run a wine empire. She was supposed to be an actress. Born in Paris on November 22nd, 1933, the only child of Baron Philippe de Rothschild, she grew up knowing what her name meant, and knowing, too, that it came with complications she had not asked for. She had survived the occupation by hiding it. Her mother had not survived at all. After the war, Philippine pursued the career she had chosen for herself. She studied at the Paris Conservatoire National d'Art Dramatique, graduated in 1958, and joined the Comédie Française, France's most prestigious state theatre. She performed under the stage name Philippine Pascal, borrowing the pseudonym from her grandfather Henri de Rothschild, who had also used Pascal when writing plays. She acted alongside Catherine Deneuve and Alain Delon. She built a genuine career, not a dilettante's hobby. She was known, by people who worked with her, as a formidable presence on stage, someone who understood timing, who understood how to hold a room, who brought to performance the same kind of total commitment that her father brought to his wines. Her father, Baron Philippe de Rothschild, had taken over the Chateau Mouton Rothschild estate in 1922 and spent decades pursuing a single obsessive goal: to have it reclassified from second tier to Premier Cru, the highest official rating in the Bordeaux system. The official French wine classification of 1855 had placed Mouton in the second rank, and Philippe considered this a wrong that needed correcting. It took him more than 50 years. In 1973, the classification was officially updated. He had Mouton's label changed to carry the words, "I am first, I was second." In the 1970s, Philippe called his daughter back from the stage. He was getting older. He needed someone to bring into the business. Philippine came. When Philippe died in 1988, Philippine inherited everything: Chateau Mouton Rothschild, Chateau d'Armagnac, Chateau Clerc Milon, and the majority ownership of the holding company Baron Philippe de Rothschild S.A. She became the first woman in 5 generations to lead the family's wine operation. The wine world at that moment was a deeply male-dominated space. Philippine was an actress by training and temperament, not a winemaker by education. And yet she ran that company for the next 26 years, with a combination of personal force, creative intelligence, and what wine critics consistently described as an almost theatrical ability to represent her products in public. She continued her father's tradition of commissioning major artists to design the labels for Mouton Rothschild's annual vintages. Francis Bacon designed the 1990 label. Prince Charles designed the 2004 label. She worked with artists ranging from the figurative to the abstract, maintaining the practice that had made Mouton's bottles some of the most collectible objects in the art and wine worlds simultaneously. She was also a shrewd commercial operator. At the time of her father's death, the company sold 1.3 million cases of wine per year. By 2000, under her leadership, that number had nearly doubled to 2.1 million cases. She built a partnership with Robert Mondavi to produce the Opus One wine in California, and she oversaw the creation of the Chilean wine Almaviva. The wine she inherited as a regional French estate, she turned into a genuinely global luxury brand. There were controversies. In 1993, she banned the Chateau Mouton Rothschild from export to the United States because the label, designed by the Swiss-French artist Balthus, depicted a nude young girl and generated a fierce backlash from American distributors and wine producers. It was a decision that forced her to weigh artistic tradition against commercial practicality, and she chose to pull the wine rather than change the label. She was appointed an officer of the Légion d'honneur in 2007. Philippine de Rothschild died in Paris on August 23, 2014, from complications following surgery. She was 80 years old. Her 3 children, Camille, Philippe, and Julien, inherited the estate. She had taken a name associated with banking, scandal, conspiracy theories, and centuries of European finance, and put it on bottles of wine that sold for thousands of dollars each. In a strange way, she had done exactly what the original Mayer Amschel Rothschild had done. She had taken what she was given and found a way to make it bigger. The filmmakers, the bankers, and the women of now. By the time you reach the current generation of Rothschild women, what you find is not a single story, but a dozen different ones, scattered across several countries, across several languages, and across professional lives that would have been unrecognizable to the family's 19th century founders. Hannah Rothschild was born on May 22, 1962, the eldest child of Jacob Rothschild, 4th Baron Rothschild, one of the central figures of the British branch of the family in the second half of the 20th century. Her mother was Serena Dunn, from a Christian background. Hannah grew up in one of the last generations of the family that still lived with a direct, daily connection to the great estates and institutions the Rothschilds had built. She read modern history at Oxford, St Hilda's College, but left before completing her degree. She went to work at the BBC's Music and Arts Department in the mid-1980s, directing documentary films. She set up an independent film company. She made profiles of painters and artists. She wrote for magazines and newspapers. She wrote novels. What is striking about her career is how deliberately it operates inside culture rather than inside finance. The family still has its financial holdings. She serves as a non-executive director of RIT Capital Partners and Windmill Hill Asset Management, both investment vehicles connected to the family. But the work she is publicly known for is not that. It is the films, it is the novels, it is the conservation of Waddesdon Manor, the vast French Renaissance-style chateau in Buckinghamshire that the family has kept alive for the National Trust for decades. It is the Illuminated River project she organised in London, which lit 15 of the Thames Central bridges in a sequence of LED art installations, transforming, as she described it, a snake of darkness into a ribbon of light. Her first novel, The Improbability of Love, published in 2015, was shortlisted for the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction and won the Bollinger Everyman Wodehouse Prize for Comic Fiction. It has been translated into more than 20 languages. Her second novel, The House of Trelawney, was published in 2020 and drew comparisons to Evelyn Waugh and Nancy Mitford for its skewering portrait of a crumbling British aristocratic family trying to survive the economic crash of 2008. There is something self-aware in that. A Rothschild writing satirical novels about old aristocratic families watching their relevance drain away. She also made The Jazz Baroness, the documentary about her great-aunt Panonica, a project that took her into the New York jazz world, into archives and family silences, and into a story that the family had, in some ways, preferred not to examine too closely. In August 2015, she became the first woman to chair the Board of Trustees of the National Gallery in London, one of the most significant cultural institutions in Britain. She held that position until October 2019. She is a trustee of the Rothschild Foundation, which preserves Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, a vast French Renaissance-style chateau built in the 1870s by Ferdinand de Rothschild to house his art collection, now held by the National Trust, but still managed by the family. She was appointed CBE in 2018 and made a Dame in 2024 for services to philanthropy in arts, culture and charity. Hannah Rothschild is, in many ways, the image of what old money looks like when it has translated itself into cultural influence rather than financial power. The name opens doors. The family history gives her material. The fortune, significant but nothing like what it was, operates in the background. What's in the foreground is work. Across the channel, a rather different version of that story was unfolding. Ariane de Rothschild, who is not a birth member of the family but married into it when she wed Benjamin de Rothschild in the 1990s, had by the 2020s taken control of the Edmund de Rothschild banking group, the Swiss branch of the family founded by her late husband's father. Benjamin died in January 2021. Ariane, who had earned an MBA from Pace University in New York and had worked on currency trading desks at Societe Generale and AIG before meeting Benjamin, became the head of the bank. The Edmund de Rothschild Group became, under her leadership, what she has noted is perhaps the world's only private bank that is 100% owned by women. Ariane and her daughters. She has consistently rejected merger overtures from the French branch of the family. led by Alexandre de Rothschild, even as some within both institutions have acknowledged the commercial logic of combining. She told the Swiss newspaper Le Matin that her four daughters will ensure succession. Whether those daughters will remain in banking or follow the trajectories of the generation before them into art, into science, into film, into something as yet unimagined, remains to be seen. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the wider family, the dispersion has continued. Emma Rothschild, the daughter of Victor Rothschild, 3rd Baron Rothschild, and thus the sister of Jacob, and therefore Hannah's aunt, became a distinguished economic historian at Harvard and holds an honorary professorship at Cambridge. Kate Rothschild, born in 1982, married and later divorced the financier Ben Goldsmith. Saskia de Rothschild chairs Chateau Lafite Rothschild, another of the great Bordeaux estates, having taken over from her father, Eric de Rothschild. What links all of these women, across their very different lives, is something harder to name than a bank balance or a title. It is the particular weight of a name that has been famous and infamous for so long that it operates almost as a separate entity from the people who carry it. It attracts conspiracy theories that are centuries old and have survived every refutation. It draws assumptions about ease and comfort that the actual lives of these women frequently contradict. And it carries a history that is simultaneously a source of pride and a burden whose dimensions keep shifting. The family no longer controls international finance. The period when a Rothschild could lend a government the money to buy a canal by the following morning, that period is long gone. What remains is something different. Influence without dominance, wealth without monopoly. A name with an enormous amount of history packed into it, and a new generation deciding, one by one, what to do with it. What remains? There is a photograph taken in 1984 at Chateau Mouton Rothschild in Bordeaux of Baron Philippe and his daughter Philippine standing together in front of the Selinus fountain on the estate. He is old. She is in middle age. Both of them look entirely at ease in that landscape, relaxed in the way that people can only be in places they have been coming to their whole lives. Philippine did not choose wine. Wine was chosen for her, by circumstances she did not control, by a father's death at the right moment, and a family heritage that needed someone to carry it forward. But she carried it anyway, and she carried it well. And when she died in 2014, the tributes that came from the global wine industry were those of someone who had genuinely made something, not merely inherited something. That tension between what is given and what is chosen runs through all of these stories. Miriam Rothschild was given a fortune and used it to fund 50 years of insect research without ever needing to apply for a grant. She chose science over society. Panonica was given everything the family represented and walked away from it into a jazz club and never fully came back. She chose the music over the manner. Hannah Rothschild was given a name that opens the doors of every gallery and institution in Britain, and she chose to use it in the service of art and culture, while also writing novels that gently mock the world she was born into. Philippine was given a wine estate when she expected to spend her life on the stage, and she chose to stop performing in one sense and start performing in another. The decline of the Rothschild family's power, if that is the right word for what happened, was not a single catastrophic event. It was a long process, driven by forces much larger than any individual family. The democratization of finance, the rise of central banks, 2 world wars, the Nazi confiscation of the Austrian branch's assets, the fragmentation of fortune across dozens of descendants who could not be bound together the way Mayer Amschel's 5 sons had been. By the time you reach the present generation, what was once the largest private fortune in the world has been divided so many times. through so many branches and marriages and inheritances that no single figure can accurately describe what the family is collectively worth. The Rothschild name does not appear on the Forbes list of the world's wealthiest individuals. It used to be shorthand for wealth that exceeded measurement. Now it means something older and more complicated. Old money that has survived long enough to become culture rather than capital. The family still manages billions, still chairs major institutions, still owns vineyards, whose bottles sell for thousands of dollars each, and whose labels are designed by artists like Francis Bacon and Prince Charles. But the period when a single Rothschild could alter the course of a war by choosing which government to lend to, that period is gone. And the women who carry the name forward know it better than anyone. They are not pretending to be something the family no longer is. They are building something different from what the family once was. A scientist in Northamptonshire, a baroness in a Harlem jazz club, an actress who became a wine queen, a filmmaker in London, a banker in Geneva, none of them the same. All of them unmistakably connected to the same long story that began in a ghetto in Frankfurt more than 250 years ago. The name still carries weight. What that weight means has simply changed. And it has changed, mostly, because of the women. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. May 19th, 1982. A plane lands at Rome's Fiumicino Airport. On board, one of the most celebrated women in the history of cinema, an Oscar winner, an international icon, and waiting at the gate, the moment she stepped off that plane, were the police. She was arrested on the tarmac, taken to a women's prison outside Naples, locked in a cell. And here's the thing. She knew it was coming. She came back anyway. This is that story, the girl from the ruins. To understand Sophia Loren, you have to understand Pozzuoli. Pozzuoli is a small town on the Bay of Naples. It sits near the edge of the Campi Flegrei, what the ancient Romans called the burning fields, a volcanic region of steaming vents and unstable ground that over the centuries has had a way of swallowing things whole. It is not a glamorous place. It never was. And in the mid-1930s, when a young, unmarried woman named Romilda Villani gave birth to a baby girl there, it must have felt like the end of the world for both of them. The baby was born on September 20th, 1934, in Rome, at the Clinica Regina Margherita, and her name, at first, was simply Sofia Ciccolone. Her mother, Romilda, had come from Pozzuoli to Rome to chase a dream of her own. She was beautiful, musically gifted, and had even won a national contest for bearing an uncanny resemblance to Greta Garbo. The prize was a trip to Hollywood and a screen test. Her family refused to let her go. So instead of Hollywood, Romilda got Riccardo Ciccolone. He was a married engineer with pretensions to the edges of the film world. He never intended to stay. He never married Romilda. He acknowledged the baby as his, allowing her to carry his name. But then he walked away and went back to his other life, his wife, his world. Romilda took the baby back to Pozzuoli. She moved in with her parents. And that cramped apartment on Via Solfatara, where the sulfur from the volcanic vents in the hillside mixed in the air with the smell of the fishermen's docks down at the harbour, became the whole world for a little girl named Sophia. It was not an easy world to grow up in. The family shared 2 bedrooms among Romilda, her 2 daughters, her parents, and an aunt. There was almost always too little food, and never quite enough money. When Romilda had a second daughter, another child by Riccardo Ciccolone, named Maria, the situation became only harder. And then the war came. Pozzuoli had a munitions plant and a harbour, which made it a target during the Allied bombing campaigns of the early 1940s. The raids came regularly. Families would scramble for shelter, running through the streets as planes swept over the bay. During one of those raids, a young Sophia was struck by shrapnel. The shard caught her on the chin. The wound healed, but the scar never fully disappeared. She carried it for the rest of her life. The famine that followed the worst of the bombing was so severe that at times there was almost nothing to drink. Her mother, on more than one occasion, used a cup to siphon water from the radiator of an abandoned car, rationing it between her two daughters, spoonful by spoonful. In school, the other children called Sophia names. They called her the stick and toothpick because she was so thin. She was also the illegitimate daughter of a man who refused to claim her family, something that in the small, traditional world of post-war southern Italy, everyone in the neighborhood knew. She was taunted for that too. By all rights, the story should have ended right there. Another child swallowed by poverty, by the shame of an absent father, by the devastation of a town barely putting itself back together after years of bombs and hunger. But Sofia Ciccolone had her mother's stubbornness and something else, something harder to name. A refusal. When the air raids forced her family to shelter in public buildings, she sometimes slipped away to the local cinema. She would sit in the dark and watch Rita Hayworth, Greta Garbo, the women her mother had once dreamed of becoming. She watched them, and she thought, that is where I am going. And then, at 14, something changed physically. The girl they had called Toothpick seemed to transform almost overnight. The sickly frame became something entirely different. By the time she was 15, people had started to take notice in a way they never had before. She was tall. Eventually, she would reach nearly 5 feet 9 inches. And her features, which cameramen would later tell her were all wrong, had taken on a quality that stopped people mid-sentence. It is worth pausing on that for a moment, because the story of Sophia Loren's physical transformation is sometimes told as a kind of fairy tale, the ugly duckling who became a swan. But what actually happened was something both more ordinary and more remarkable than that. She did not simply become beautiful in the conventional sense. She became impossible to ignore. There is a difference. Plenty of conventionally beautiful women have passed through Hollywood and left no lasting impression. Sophia Loren was going to be impossible to forget. And even as a teenager, the people who encountered her in those Roman audition rooms seemed to sense it, however awkwardly they expressed it. Her mother began entering her in beauty pageants. In October 1949, Sophia entered the Queen of the Sea contest, organized by a Neapolitan newspaper. She won a consolation prize, some cash, and a train ticket to Rome. That train ticket would change the entire trajectory of what came next. By 1950, mother and daughter had moved to Rome. They were looking for work at Cinecittà, the great Italian film studio that was slowly crawling back to life after the war. Sophia started taking small parts wherever she could find them, bit roles, crowd scenes, anything. She modelled for illustrated romance magazines under the name Sofia Villani. She went to beauty pageants. She entered the Miss Italia 1950 contest and made it to the final 3, winning the title of Miss Elegance. And it was at one of those early contest events in Rome. The exact circumstances are slightly disputed by various accounts, but it is generally agreed to have been around 1950. That a well-dressed, already middle-aged film producer named Carlo Ponti noticed a 15 or 16-year-old girl in the room and sent her a note telling her she really ought to be in pictures. What followed from that moment is one of the most complicated, scrutinized, and enduring relationships in the history of Italian cinema. But before we get there, before we get to the bigamy charges, the arrests, the exile, and the decades of legal chaos that followed. There is something important to understand about who Carlo Ponti was, and just how much that relationship changed everything. The man who made her, and what it cost. Carlo Ponti was, by the time he first crossed paths with Sofia Ciccolone, already a significant figure in the Italian film industry. He was born in 1912 in Magenta, Lombardy, trained as a lawyer, and had transitioned into film production in the early 1940s. He had helped launch the careers of Italian cinema's most important voices. He had money, taste, and connections. He was also, very much, a married man. His wife was Giuliana Fiastri. They had 2 children together. There was nothing particularly secretive about his domestic life. And yet, when he began steering the career of a teenager from Pozzuoli, nobody seems to have raised much of an alarm. At least, not loudly enough to stop what came next. There has always been a question that hangs over the early years of their relationship, and it is not a question that has a comfortable answer. He was a man in his late 30s with enormous power over who got work and who did not. She was a teenager from a devastated background, with no money and a desperate, aching need to escape the life she had come from. The dynamic between them was, at the very least, profoundly unequal. Over the decades, Sophia herself would push back against the idea that she had ever simply been Ponti's creation. She was clear that the talent was hers, that the discipline was hers, that nobody had handed her anything. And that is also true. But the circumstances of how they came together, and what she needed from the world at 15 that he was positioned to provide, is a part of the record that is impossible to simply set aside. What is equally true is that by any conventional measure, the relationship worked. Not just professionally, though it did work professionally, in ways that transformed Italian cinema, but personally, and over a span of time that outlasted the marriages and careers of almost everyone around them. Ponti signed the young Sophia to a contract and began shaping her for the screen. He had a friend at the Titanus production company, Goffredo Lombardo, who in 1952 gave her the name she would carry forever, Sophia Loren. The surname was a twist on the name of Swedish actress Märta Thoren. The spelling of her first name was adjusted to make it feel more accessible to international audiences. In those early years on set, she was also sometimes credited as Sophia Lazaro, and the joke around the studios was that her beauty could raise Lazarus from the dead. Ponti nurtured her. He found her roles. He introduced her to director Vittorio De Sica, who recognized something in her immediately and would go on to direct her in some of the most important films of her life. He pushed her toward the camera with a confidence that suggested he knew exactly what the world would make of her, even when she herself was not sure. But their relationship was not simply professional. By the time Sophia was in her late teens, she and Ponti had become romantically involved. He was more than 20 years older than her. He was still married, and in Catholic Italy of the early 1950s, none of that was a small thing. Sophia's rise through Italian cinema in those years was remarkably fast. She had her first starring role in Aida in 1953. Her real breakthrough came in 1954, with The Gold of Naples, directed by De Sica. Her early collaborations with Marcello Mastroianni, beginning with Too Bad She's Bad, also released in 1954, showed a playful, fizzing chemistry that the Italian public responded to enormously. By 1956, she was appearing in American productions. Stanley Kramer cast her in The Pride and the Passion, an epic war film set in Napoleonic Spain, alongside Cary Grant and Frank Sinatra. The following year, she starred opposite Alan Ladd in Boy on a Dolphin. Hollywood had come calling, and she answered. In 1958, Paramount Pictures signed Sophia Loren to a 5-picture contract. It was an extraordinary achievement for a woman who had learned English by studying scripts. She arrived in Los Angeles with essentially no fluency in the language and proceeded to make film after film, learning as she went, holding her own opposite some of the biggest names on earth. But through all of this glittering professional ascent, the situation with Ponti was becoming legally complicated in ways that would eventually spiral into one of the most bizarre domestic legal sagas of the post-war era. Divorce was not permitted in Italy. Ponti was still married to Giuliana Fiastri, and yet he and Sofia wanted to formalize what had by then been a long relationship. So in September 1957, they found a workaround, a proxy marriage in Mexico. Two male lawyers stood in for them. The ceremony was legal under Mexican law. The couple considered themselves married. Italy did not agree. Under Italian law, Ponti's previous marriage to Giuliana had not been dissolved. The Mexican divorce and remarriage were not recognized. This meant that Ponti now stood accused of bigamy. And Sofia, under the specific language of Italian law at the time, faced charges of concubinage. Warrants were issued for both of them. In 1962, with the legal pressure becoming impossible to ignore, they annulled the 1957 Mexican marriage. They continued to live together, not married in the eyes of any law that Italy recognized, trying to find a path through. The solution they eventually landed on was drastic. They renounced their Italian citizenship and became French citizens, with their application personally approved by French Prime Minister Georges Pompidou in 1964 to 65. Once they were French citizens, Ponti was able to obtain a divorce from Giuliana that was recognized by French law. And on April 9th, 1966, nearly 9 years after their first attempt, Sophia Loren and Carlo Ponti married for the second time. They were finally, actually, legally married. In 1968, a Roman court formally cleared them of the bigamy charges. But the years of legal chaos had meant something else, something more personally painful. Sophia Loren could not safely go home. Italy, the country of her birth, of her childhood, of everything that had formed her, had become, in a practical sense, hostile territory. She was living in Paris, in Geneva, in the spaces between. And there was still more legal trouble coming, far worse than the bigamy drama, the kind of trouble that would, eventually, put her in prison. But before that, before the handcuffs and the prison cell and the international headlines, she needed to win an Oscar. And the story of how she did that is one of the most quietly devastating things in this whole story. The performance that broke her open. While the legal battles over her marriage played out in courtrooms across Europe, Sophia Loren was also doing something that had nothing to do with scandal. She was becoming one of the greatest film actresses in the world. In 1960, Vittorio De Sica cast her in Two Women, a film called La Chiocciara in Italian, based on a novel by Alberto Moravia. The story was set during the Second World War. Loren played Cesira, a widowed Roman shopkeeper who flees the city with her 13-year-old daughter to escape the bombing and the chaos of the Nazi occupation. The mother and daughter hide in the countryside, scraping by, trying to survive. And then, near the end of the film, something terrible happens to both of them. A violent act of brutality committed by soldiers, from which neither of them fully recovers. The film pulled from something real inside Sophia Loren in a way that almost nothing else had. She understood instinctively what it meant to be a woman trying to protect a child in a world that had gone violently wrong. She had lived around the edges of exactly that reality as a child in Pozzuoli. De Sica had cast her in this role when the original plan had been for Loren to play the daughter and for Anna Magnani to play the mother. Magnani withdrew. Loren took on the mother. What she gave to that role was startling. The performance stripped away every last trace of the glamorous, wisecracking, impossibly beautiful screen presence she had developed over the previous decade. What was left was raw, exposed, and unforgettable. She was so confident that she would not win the Academy Award that she stayed in Rome when the ceremony was held in April 1962. She was at home, asleep, when the phone rang in the middle of the Italian night. It was Cary Grant calling from Los Angeles to tell her that she had just become the first person in history to win the Best Actress Oscar for a performance in a non-English language film. The Academy replaced the statuette years later after it was stolen from her Italian villa by thieves. But that is almost beside the point. The Oscar itself was almost beside the point. What mattered was what De Sica had said of her, that before Two Women she had been a performer. After it, she was an actress. The 1960s continued in much the same vein. Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow in 1963, which won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. Marriage Italian Style in 1964, for which she earned a second Oscar nomination. A Countess from Hong Kong in 1967, directed by Charlie Chaplin, a man she had idolized, opposite Marlon Brando, with whom she famously did not get along. Through all of it, she remained connected to Ponti. He produced many of her films. He managed much of the financial infrastructure of their shared life. And when that financial infrastructure came under scrutiny by the Italian government, not just once, but repeatedly, over many years, she would pay the highest personal price: tax, exile, and the prison cell. The Italian government had been watching Carlo Ponti's finances for years. In the 1970s, the scrutiny widened to include Sophia Loren herself. In January 1979, she was tried in absentia, meaning she did not appear in person, on charges related to complicity with Ponti in income tax evasion, the misuse of Italian government film subsidies, and the illegal export of Italian money and artworks out of the country. She was acquitted on all counts. That should have been the end of it. But Italian tax law operated in layers, and there was a separate, older dispute still sitting in the courts, stemming from income taxes she owed for the years 1963 and 1964. The Italian tax authorities maintained she had underpaid by 112 million lire, equivalent at the time to roughly 180,000 US dollars. Sophia maintained that the error had been made by her accountant, a man who had since died, and that she had not been directly responsible for the mistake. Italy's top appeals court imposed a sentence: 30 days in prison and a fine. For years, she could not safely return to Italy to face the sentence without being arrested. She lived outside her home country, in Paris, in Switzerland, cut off from the place, the people, and the culture she still considered the center of her identity. She missed her mother. She missed her sister. She missed the streets of Naples and the sound of Italian around her. And so, in May 1982, she made a decision that surprised almost everyone. She got on a plane in Geneva and flew home. She had told an Italian television reporter before departing that she was going back to serve her sentence, even though she believed it was unjust. She was not coming back to make a film, she told the journalists at the airport. She was coming back because she loved Italy. The police were waiting when her plane landed at Fiumicino Airport on May 19, 1982. She was 47 years old. They put her in a squad car and drove her to the women's prison at Caserta, just outside Naples, not far from where she had grown up. She served 17 days of the 30-day sentence before being released early. 17 days. For a woman who had spent her childhood running from bombs, raising 2 children, while navigating decades of legal chaos, and living in voluntary exile from her homeland for the better part of a decade. It was, in some ways, one of the strangest and most public humiliations of her life. The woman who had held an Oscar in her hands was now holding a prison identity card. What she experienced inside that prison was not something she ever chose to describe in detail publicly, but she spoke about the decision to return as something she had needed to do, not only to satisfy the legal obligation, but for herself. She had been carrying the weight of the exile for too long. Every year she could not safely walk down a Roman street. Every birthday and Christmas she spent away from her mother and her country. Every small and ordinary Italian thing she had been cut off from. All of it had accumulated into a weight she was finally ready to set down, whatever setting it down required. The Italian public's response surprised no one who had been paying attention. There was no crowing from the press about a celebrity getting what she deserved. The outpouring was almost entirely sympathetic. Letters arrived at the prison. People came to stand outside the gates. Her popularity, which the authorities may have assumed would erode under the weight of the conviction, did not erode at all. She walked out of that prison as loved as she had walked in. Years later, in 2013, the Italian Supreme Court would clear her of a separate related dispute over taxes from 1974, finally, definitively, putting the legal saga to rest after decades of proceedings. But there was another dimension to all of this that rarely gets discussed when people talk about the scandals of Sophia Loren's life. A more private, more painful set of struggles that had nothing to do with courts or governments at all. The heartbreak. Nobody televised. By the early 1960s, Sophia Loren was one of the most coveted women in the world. And yet for years, the thing she wanted most was something no amount of fame or money could simply produce: a child. She had suffered 2 miscarriages before her first son was born, 2 pregnancies that ended in loss, and the grief of each had been played out, unavoidably, given who she was, in partial public view. Medical coverage of celebrities in that era was intrusive in ways that could be startling even now, and reporters tracked the details of her pregnancies with the same breathless attention they gave to her films. She did not have the luxury of grieving in private. Each loss was documented, discussed, and analyzed by strangers who had no real stake in her pain. There is something about that particular cruelty that is worth sitting with for a moment. Here was a woman who had grown up with almost nothing, who had built her career on strength and discipline and sheer refusal to be beaten, and who was now being forced to experience some of the most intimate moments of human grief in front of a watching world. The public that adored her felt entitled to know. The press obliged them. She had no real recourse. After the second miscarriage, she was referred to a Swiss fertility specialist, Dr. Hubert de Watteville, in Geneva. He determined that she was deficient in estrogen. With hormone treatment and complete bed rest throughout her pregnancy, not partial rest, but absolute confinement for the entire term, she became pregnant again. Carlo Ponti Jr. was born on December 29th, 1968. She was 34 years old. Her second son, Eduardo Ponti, was born on January 6th, 1973. She later described the experience of finally having children as the truest joy of her life. In the 1980s, as the legal storms continued to swirl, she stepped back from acting deliberately and devoted herself to raising her boys. She turned down roles that other actresses would have given anything for, including the part of Alexis Carrington in the television series Dynasty in 1981, which would have been a significant television return. She later narrowly missed out on playing a major recurring role in Falcon Crest in 1984, a part that ultimately went to Gina Lollobrigida when negotiations fell through at the last moment. But these were choices she made willingly. The woman who had survived wartime Pozzuoli on nothing, who had spent years in legal limbo, who had gone to prison for a tax debt she believed was not truly her fault. She was not going to miss the childhood of her sons. And then there was the matter of the men who had wanted her before she chose Ponty, and what their wanting had cost all of them. The men who fell. Sophia Loren attracted the kind of attention that seemed to unhinge otherwise reasonable people. The most famous example is Cary Grant. When they were cast together in The Pride and the Passion in 1957, Grant, then 53 years old, married to actress and writer Betsy Drake, began an affair with Loren. By the time the film finished shooting, the affair was complicated enough that Grant arranged for Loren to replace his own wife in their next film together, Houseboat, rewriting the script to accommodate the change. Betsy Drake, who had originally written the Houseboat screenplay herself, asked not to receive credit for a script that had been reworked to remove her from it. The affair ended before Houseboat's production was complete. Tensions on set were significant. Grant wanted the relationship to continue. Sophia chose Ponty. Grant reportedly proposed marriage. She declined. Sophia later acknowledged the affair in her autobiography, but was always careful about exactly how much she revealed. Grant, for his part, maintained his dignity publicly. But people who knew him in that period described a man who took the rejection genuinely hard. Then there was Peter Sellers. When they made The Millionaires together in 1960, Sellers became so completely consumed by his feelings for Sophia that the situation spiraled beyond the merely awkward. He left his first wife, Anne Howe, during the production. His 5-year-old daughter later asked him if he still loved them, and, as the story has been told many times since, he answered that of course he did, just not as much as Sophia Loren. Sophia was clear, both to Sellers and to biographers who asked about it afterward, that his feelings were never returned in the way he hoped. She had no romantic interest in him. The relationship was professional, and on her end, it stayed that way. Sellers's obsession was entirely his own. Richard Burton, when he co-starred with her in a television remake of Brief Encounter, described her in terms that suggested he was also not entirely immune. He noted her intelligence alongside her physical presence. She famously beat him at Scrabble twice during the production. And then, on the less romantic end of the spectrum, there were the more unwelcome attentions. The internet age brought its own particular kind of intrusion. In 1999, Sophia filed a lawsuit against 76 websites for using fabricated intimate photographs of her without her consent on adult-oriented platforms. She won the legal fight. But the incident was a reminder that fame, especially for women, has never come with reliable protection from exploitation. A family built on rubble. For all the legal drama, the exile, and the scandals that followed her through her career, perhaps the most quietly remarkable thing about Sophia Loren is what she built inside the walls of her private life, and how much of it she built against the grain of everything that could have broken her. She had grown up without a father. She saw her mother's ambitions crushed before they ever had a chance to bloom. She was mocked as a child, underfed, shaped by violence and poverty and loss. The women who come from those beginnings so often replicate the instability they grew up inside. Sophia, largely, did not. She married once. She stayed married for 50 years, until Carlo Ponti died in Geneva on January 10th, 2007, from pulmonary complications at the age of 94. Their marriage, for all the controversy that had surrounded its early years, the bigamy charges, the legal gymnastics, the exile, endured in ways that baffled and impressed in equal measure people who watched from the outside. She lost her mother in 1991. Romilda Villani, the woman who had rationed sips of radiator water for her daughters, who had dragged her children to beauty pageants with a dress sewn from curtain taffeta, who had dreamed of being Greta Garbo and ended up raising a legend instead, died of cancer that year. Sophia was devastated. She spoke about it rarely, but the grief in her face when she did speak about her mother was unmistakable. Her sons went on to their own careers. Carlo Ponti Jr. became a conductor. Eduardo Ponti became a film director. In 2020, Eduardo directed his mother in The Life Ahead, a Netflix film in which she played an aging Holocaust survivor caring for a young refugee. The film was received with enormous warmth. Sophia was 86 years old, and reviewers struggled to find the words to describe how fully she inhabited the role. She won multiple awards for it. Her sister, Maria's life, had its own remarkable chapter. Maria Ciccolone, the younger daughter Riccardo Ciccolone, had not even wanted to formally acknowledge as his own, later married Romano Mussolini, the son of fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. The marriage, and the surname that came with it, was not lost on anyone who remembered where the two Ciccolone sisters had come from. And then there was the Oscar, the one she had won in 1961 for Two Women, the one she had not been there to receive, that Cary Grant had called to tell her about in the middle of the Italian night. The original statuette was stolen from her villa by thieves. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences replaced it for a small fee. The replacement sits somewhere in her home now, next to the honorary Oscar the Academy gave her in 1991, when they declared her one of the greatest treasures of world cinema. She had also, years earlier, signed a lawsuit over fake photographs on the internet. She had served time in a prison cell and walked out of it with her head up. She had outlasted bigamy charges, 2 fraudulent marriages, a decade of exile, a tax evasion sentence, 2 miscarriages, the death of her husband, and the death of her mother. In September 2023, at the age of 88, she fell at her home in Geneva and fractured her hip and thigh bone. She was taken to hospital. The world held its breath for a few days. She recovered. What stays? There is a photograph from 1957, taken at a Hollywood party to promote one of her early American films, that has become one of the most recognizable images in the history of celebrity photography. Sophia Loren sits at a table in an elegant evening dress. Next to her stands Jane Mansfield, leaning forward with a smile. And Sophia is not looking at Mansfield. She is looking sidelong with an expression of studied calm, directly at the camera. She has been described as looking amused or suspicious or bemused. She has never particularly confirmed what she was thinking. The photograph captures something real about the way she moved through the world. She was always aware, always watching. She had grown up in a place that had taught her that the world would not take care of her, and that lesson had given her a particular kind of alertness that never left, even when everything else changed. She went from a slum in wartime Pozzuoli to the Academy Awards stage, from a name nobody recognized to a name that was recognized on every continent. From a girl called Toothpick to a woman film critic Rex Reed once described as having emerged as beautiful as Aphrodite rising from the sea. And through all of it, the fame, the men, the marriages, the courts, the prison, the loss, she remained, somehow, recognizably herself. She opened a restaurant in Florence in 2021. She has written cookbooks, 3 of them, reflecting a love of food that goes back to the years when there was never enough of it. She has designed eyeglass frames. She has made perfume. She has recorded music, including a comedic album with Peter Sellers that became a bestseller, made before his infatuation with her made their working relationship uncomfortable. The camera operators at her early auditions told her to consider surgery on her nose and her mouth. She did not. She won an Oscar instead. Her teeth were too prominent, some said. Her face was too unusual to be classical. She answered by becoming one of the most photographed women of the 20th century. She was, by the admission of her own wet nurse, considered an unpromising-looking baby. She went on to be described by Vogue and countless others over a career that spanned 7 decades as one of the most beautiful women in human history. But beauty was never really the point, even when it was what everyone else seemed to be talking about. The point was what she did with the life she had been handed, and with the life she then went and built for herself on top of the wreckage she had started with. The point was the discipline, the stubbornness, the refusal to be defined entirely by what other people said about her, whether they were calling her toothpick, or screen goddess, or criminal defendant, or one of cinema's greatest treasures. The story of Sophia Loren is not a clean arc from poverty to triumph. It is a much longer, stranger, more complicated thing. A story full of scandal that she did not always invite, full of legal battles that followed her across decades and borders, full of private grief that the cameras mostly did not catch. It is a story about a girl who grew up in the rubble of post-war Italy with a scar on her chin from the shrapnel that had almost killed her, and who decided, before she was old enough to fully understand what the decision would cost, that she was going to go anyway. She went, and the world never quite looked away. It is tempting, at the end of a story like this, to reach for a tidy lesson, to say that Sophia Loren's life proves something definitive about beauty or talent or the resilience of the human spirit. But her story resists that kind of neatness. She was not a symbol. She was a person, specific, complicated, shaped by forces that were often brutal and sometimes unfair, who made a series of choices across 9 decades and somehow, improbably, came out the other side still standing, still working, still impossible to ignore. That is not a lesson. That is just a life, and it happens to be one of the most extraordinary ones the 20th century produced. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.